So it's been a little over a week since I watched The Last Jedi and I've had some time to think about it. The audience seems to be split on whether the movie was good or not. Unfortunately, it seems that a lot of people think that the criticisms of the movie are just a bunch of trolls with no merit to their arguments, and that they wouldn't be happy no matter how the movie came out. While this is true in some aspects, I don't think it's true for most of the people that dislike the movie. I personally am not a fan of this movie. As a standalone movie, it was okay. Unfortunately, it is not a standalone movie. It is a movie that is part of a series, and therefore it needs to carry on with the plot elements established in the prior movies. People may not have liked Episode 7, but at least they had the benefit of being decades in the future and carried off the storylines of the original trilogy. The problem with Episode 8 is it feels like the director looked at all those story elements set up in Episode 7 and just said screw that and made his own movie. I think Disney made a mistake and have different visionaries come in to make their own individual movies because the goals and priorities got lost. I don't hate Rian Johnson because he made the movie he wanted to make, but I think it was the wrong direction. Episode 7 established a lot of plot points that should have been carried over into the following two movies. Instead, they were wrapped unceremoniously or abandoned altogether. It seems people are more forgiving a movie dropping plot points, but it's not something that carries over into other mediums. Game of Thrones wouldn't be popular if the first book established all the characters and backstories, and then the second book threw all those stories away and altered the character motivations and personalities completely. So I'm going to attempt to put together my version of what I think Episode 8 should have been. I'm going to leave in a few of the story elements from Episode 8 that I really enjoyed, but for the most part, it is a complete deviation from The Last Jedi. Also, this is just a plot overview. More could be added in to flesh out some other characters, and I won't be doing too much of the humor that was in Episode 8, but that can also be thrown in. I will be adding my reasoning for certain plot decisions throughout. So, Episode 8, the movie begins right where Episode 7 leaves off, with Rey handing Luke his lightsaber. Luke stares at it for a moment in disbelief before asking her where she got it. Maz Kanata gave it to me, she says. Luke slightly smirks. Maz, why doesn't that surprise me? Then he looks up at her and asks who she is and why she's there. She explains the state of the galaxy, of the First Order and the Resistance, and that Leia had sent her. Luke shakes his head and again asks her who she is, like he did in Episode 8. She explains her brief glimpses of the Force and how it scares her, and she hopes Luke will teach her. Luke shakes his head, explaining that he is not a good teacher. They go back and forth a bit before she asks him why he left. He explains that he left to prepare himself, that once Kylo turned and he realized that there was another powerful Force user manipulating Kylo, that he had to train himself for the confrontation. He tells her that she should stay out of it and that he will go to face it alone. She refuses, and after more arguing, he can tell that Rey will not back down. He sees the danger in letting someone so powerful in the Force run around untrained, and finally relents. This begins a series of scenes that are supposed to progress the storylines to months or even years down the road. We need to establish that the First Order didn't just take over right after the Starkiller base destroyed these couple planets, and that the galaxy didn't just give up right away. So we need to get a time lapse in here. So we would have a series of scenes of Rey being taught about Force powers by Luke, followed by scenes of Kylo being taught by Snoke. It's important because it carries over Snoke's intention of making Kylo stronger from Episode 7, where he said that he needed to bring him back to train him more, as well as giving a logical reasoning to Rey's growing mastery of the Force. And instead of just saying she's really just powerful and just picks it up, we get to see her progress through the training, failing at first, before she slowly gets the hang of it. We can also show people who are not familiar with the lore behind Star Wars some interesting things. Luke can teach her the Jedi Code. Snoke can talk about the Sith Code. He's not a Sith, but can use it as a teaching tool. We also need to show the dramatic difference between the training methods of Luke and Snoke. Luke is patient and calm, teaching Rey slowly with reassurance. We need to show Snoke being impatient and harsh, punishing Kylo with pain and ridicule for the slightest mistakes. The audience already knows who is good and who is bad, but we need to drive the point home and provide the true context of the differences between the two groups. This can also show the audience the pain and suffering Kylo goes through, which will help make him more than just a one-dimensional villain. Intercut between these montages of training from both duos, we see quick clips of battles between the First Order and the Resistance. We see a clip of the First Order bombarding a planet from space, and then we see a clip of Poe fighting against some TIE fighters somewhere else in the galaxy. We see the First Order holding a speech over a different conquered planet by Hux, like the speech on the Starkiller base that he gave. Then a shot of Finn helping some Resistance fighters escape an ambush. The intent of these scenes is to show the takeover of the galaxy by the First Order, and that the Resistance is slowly losing ground. We can also introduce Vice Admiral Holdo in these clips. We can show her being a badass leader and the friendship she has with Leia. We want to establish her early and show that she has the credentials for military command, not just hear about it. After a while, we cut back to the end of a segment of training for Kylo. General Hux enters the room. Snoke tells him now that the time has come to cut off the head of the Resistance and eliminate the Jedi in one action. He concludes that while he cannot locate Luke or Rey, he can draw them out of hiding by going after the ones they care about. He tells Hux to put together a team and capture Poe and Finn. Hux tells him he has just the person for the job. Then he turns to Kylo. He tells him that he has grown much stronger, but that he can sense the conflict in him. He says he still holds on to his family deep down, and his thoughts drift to that girl who beat you on Starkiller Base. Kylo says he's dedicated, but Snoke knows better. He tells him he has to prove it. He has to go and capture Leia and bring her to him. By having the people that Rey and Luke care about, he can draw at least one of them out of hiding, who will then in turn lead the other to Snoke. After his meeting, Kylo goes off into his chamber and sits down in front of the broken helmet of Vader once more. He begs his grandfather to teach him again, to show him the visions and help him regain his focus. Then we hear Vader's voice. Vader shows him the images of the Republic and the events of the previous movies, but the images are distorted. Kylo doesn't notice because he was never part of these moments, but we as the audience know they aren't right from having seen them play out. Before the scene ends, Vader tells him to capture Leia, that she and Luke betrayed him and must be punished, that they let the galaxy fall to the ruin for their own glory, and that only Kylo, Vader's true heir, can fix it. Then he tells Kylo to listen to Snoke and do as he commands, as he still has much to teach him. Kylo suggests maybe he should replace him and take over himself, and Vader suspiciously tells him no very quickly. He tells him that Snoke is too powerful for him. He tells him to focus on his training to complete his mission, that killing Luke, Rey, and Leia will be the last thing he needs to do to fully embrace the dark side and to unlock his true potential. This is where we get to correct one of the big problems from both movies, Captain Phasma. She was built up to be this badass and looks the part, but her character has her legs taken out from under her in both movies by minimal screen time and bad deaths. We needed to show why she is so special and give Gwendoline Christie something to actually do in this movie. So we cut to Poe on a random planet providing aerial support to Resistance ground troops. Things seem to be going well when all of a sudden a large number of TIE fighters appear in the sky. Poe starts a fight, but it is obvious they're there specifically for him. We let him take a good number of them out, but this just draws all the attention to him. This is where Phasma drops in with a special new fighter just for her and fires a weapon that mobilizes Poe's ship. He crashes, and just as he starts to crawl out of his wrecked fighter, he sees stormtroopers rushing to capture him. He takes out a few with a blaster before Phasma captures him. Right after Poe is knocked out, we do a quick cut to Rey waking up with a start in her bed. Sweat is running down her face and she's breathing heavily. She has a look of concern and confusion on her face. She starts to think about what happened when the door to her hut opens quickly and Luke steps in. He sees her and asks her if she's alright. She shakes her head and says yes. Luke looks at her skeptically but says nothing. He tells her to follow him and they resume with the training. We can toss in a new training segment here, maybe some hand-to-hand combat. A quick lesson on the forms of lightsaber combat, but instead of having her practice with a lightsaber, he has her practicing with her staff. Then we cut to Finn. He's on some planet attacking a convoy of supplies controlled by the First Order. However, the ambush turns south as they quickly realize that their attempt at an ambush was a trap in and of itself. Phasma shows up again. The last scene with her demonstrated her badass ability and fighter. Now I get to see her on the ground. We really get to let her cut loose. This is an epic sequence of her cutting through Resistance fighters like a knife. We also get to see Finn go off and do some really impressive fighting, give the audience a real show of how good these two are. Then they meet face to face, that good old-fashioned one-on-one. They shoot at each other for a little bit before switching to melee weapons like they did in the movie. Despite Finn's best efforts, Phasma is too much and she beats him. What we want to do here is set the stage that Phasma is clearly superior to Finn right now. I would say this, carry over into episode 9, where Finn and Phasma may fight one more time, and Finn comes out on top. This will give him some growth and development into the future. After Finn is captured, we once again do a quick cut to Rey. This time she's meditating beside Luke, but the images of Finn being captured flood her mind and she abruptly snaps out of her meditation. Luke looks at her again, and this time she's even more panicked and distressed. He asks her what she saw. This time she tells him the truth, that she saw images of Finn and Poe being captured. Luke tells her to calm down. He gives her a variation of the speech that Yoda gave to Anakin, that the future is always in motion and that the visions she has are only possibilities, not set in stone. He tells her that she needs to continue training. She's reluctant, but she agrees. Now we get to Leia. She's on a ship commanding a small fleet. They are attacking a smaller First Order fleet when several First Order Star Destroyers jump in from hyperspace. They quickly start destroying the other ships in Leia's fleet. She commands Vice Admiral Holdo to evacuate. Holdo jumps to lightspeed, and 2 First Order ships jump after her. Leia attempts to jump away as well, but her ship's engines and hyperdrive are targeted and immobilized. Her ship is surrounded and a series of fighters approach to force their way on board. You can give a callback here if you want to Vader breaching Leia's ship in Episode 4, with all the soldiers in the hall shooting the doorway before Vader enters, but this time it's Kylo. But this time, behind Kylo, I would have two unique, hooded, ominous characters. He tells them, find her, and they slowly walk away from him, making their way through the ship. This is where we get a first glimpse at two of the Knights of Ren. Another plot point that was left out. We don't want to show them all, but we need to see them in action and carry some of the hype about them from Episode 7 into this movie, into the future. The next few minutes is these two knights cutting through the ship, brutally cutting down everyone in their path. They can have some Force ability, but not too much. Logically, Snoke wouldn't want the Knights of Ren to be fully trained in the Force, as it could pose a threat to him, but he needs them to be superior to everyone they meet. Once again, we cut to Rey, but this time she's sitting in front of a bench with spare parts scattered on the bench in front of her. Luke is behind her, offering up advice and trying to calmly direct her. Then the parts of the bench slowly begin to lift up in the air on their own. They slowly start to come together. True fans of Star Wars will realize what is happening here, but the audience will get to see something they have never seen in a Star Wars movie before. Rey is building her own lightsaber. The twist, though, is when the lightsaber is completed. As it lands in her hands, she ignites the blade like normal, but then another blade ignites beneath it. Rey has built a saber staff. We've seen her using her own staff throughout the movie so far, and she seems to be pretty proficient with it, so it seems only natural to give her a saber staff. Luke looks on with a slight smile as Rey steps out and begins practicing with it. Then Luke ignites his own lightsaber. They spar for a bit. They are focused, but in the duel they toss back and forth and banter. You want to show the level of connecting and bonding the two have made in their time together. Luke comes out on top of the duel, but Rey has shown massive improvement from the beginning and had him on the defensive on several occasions. He tells her that she has grown strong, but that he is proud of her progress. He tells her that in the morning he has a big test for her in mind. When she asks what it is, he nods towards the water. She looks down and we see the sunken X-Wing that we saw in Episode 8. She smiles and says, "I'll give it a try." Luke smiles back. There is no try, do or do not. Rey looks at him confused, wondering why he's talking so oddly. He shakes his head. Thinking of an old friend, he replies. Then they walk away toward their huts together. We cut back to Leia's ship, and the Knights of Ren as they cut down the last few defenders. Finally, they track down Leia, who's standing her ground on the bridge. They go after her, but she actually puts up a fight. Now here's one movie where I'm a little uncertain how far I would go with Leia's abilities. I think a lot of people want to see Leia actually demonstrate some Force powers, but do we have her go full Jedi and pull out a lightsaber and duel with the Knights of Ren? Do we ever only use Force powers? I think you wanted to show that she has some ability but not go over the top with it. I think her using some Force pushes here and there and some Force dashes would suffice, but no lightsabers. That's just me, and if they went with a lightsaber I wouldn't be upset by it. The important thing to do, even if only slightly, is to explain just at some point how she learned to use the Force. Even something as simple when the Knights walk in and approach her and she Force pushes them away, one of the people on the bridge can act surprised and look at her oddly. She could turn and say something like, "Luke taught me a few tricks," or something like that. You want to establish that she has at some point been trained by Luke. One of the big criticisms of the movie was Leia just suddenly doing this Superman fly through space with no demonstration of her ability in the Force before, and no explanation of it afterwards. So we want to correct that issue here. So after a short standoff with the Knights, Kylo enters. When he does, Leia sees him and hesitates. That gives one of the Knights an opening to hit Leia and knock her out. Kylo unleashes a large Force push at the Knight who knocked her out, sending him crashing against a wall. We leave it a mystery if it was because he was trying to keep his mom safe, or if he wanted to be the one to subdue her. He is wearing his mask, so we are unsure. He tells the other Knights to take her, then turns and makes his way off to the bridge and heads back to his fighter. There are several scenes throughout this movie we want to demonstrate where we aren't sure of Kylo's actual intentions. A lot of the time his expressions are going to be hidden behind his mask, so we really won't know what his line of thought is. We cut back to Rey, and once again she is woken with a vision, this time of Leia's capture. It is so intense she's almost brought to tears. She is breathing heavy again and sweating, and she rushes out of her hut to cool off in the night air. To her surprise, Luke is standing outside staring off toward the sky. "Luke, I had another vision. This time it was..." Luke turns slowly, and she sees the pain in his eyes. "You saw Leia being captured too?" Luke slowly nods. She asks if he had seen the other visions she had seen. He nods again. She gets mad and begins to yell, asking why he hadn't told her. Luke tells her that if he had, she would have wanted to leave, and that she wasn't ready. Rey asks what they are supposed to do, let them all die? Luke looks down at the ground. If we rush off to fight before we are ready, all will be lost. We have to think about the fate of the entire galaxy, not just the lives of a few individuals. Rey gets even more upset, asking how he can say that. How can he let his sister die? He tells her that he doesn't want to let her die, and that everything in his heart is telling him to go save her, but he knows he can't. The risks are too high. Rey shakes her head in anger and disbelief. If we aren't willing to risk our lives for those we care about, What is the point of fighting for the galaxy after all? She turns and begins to walk away. He yells at her stop, that her training isn't complete. We get to have another parallel here of Luke ignoring Obi-Wan and Yoda's warnings about rushing off before they are ready, only this time it is Luke being the one who is cautious, and Rey ignoring him. We see her rush down toward the Millennium Falcon and hop on board, as they quickly race off to find their friends. The last thing we see is Luke watching them disappear into the sky. We cut to Snoke's dreadnought. After a few exterior shots, we go to Kylo and see him enter the prison cell where his mother is being held. He stops in front of her and stares at her. She looks up at him. "Take off that mask and let me look at the face of my son," she says. He tells her that her son is dead. She stands up and walks to the bars. "No," she tells him. "He is standing in front of me." Kylo hesitates for a moment, finally takes off his mask. We can have a full scene where Leia tries to plead with Kylo that it isn't too late, but Kylo refuses. He tells her that everyone lied to him about his grandfather and that they betrayed him. Leia tells him that he's being manipulated, telling him once more what actually happened, but he won't listen. Then she tells him that she forgives him for murdering Han, and that Han still loves him. At this, it looks like Kylo might break down, but instead he throws his helmet back on and opens the door. He commands her to walk, and she lowers her head in defeat. She walks in front of him, and he escorts her to the waiting Snoke, who has Finn and Poe bound and sitting on the floor in front of him. Snoke looks at her and smiles. Now what I would do here is recreate one of the scenes I enjoyed from Episode 8. Luke returns to his hut, but he finds R2-D2 waiting for him. We recreate the scene of him explaining his actions to R2, and then R2 replaying the image of Obi-Wan, telling him that he is her only hope. We can even have Luke say, "That was low." That was a really well done scene. Luke sits down on the bed and breathes heavily, then closes his eyes in thought. After a few seconds, his eyes open and he walks out of the hut in silence. Then we see him walk to the waterline, close his eyes, and hold out his hand. Then we see his X-Wing slowly rise out of the water. It's done slowly, but with little real effort. This will be a good way of showing how much stronger Luke has become since the last time we saw him trying to lift the X-Wing and fail. I think a lot of people were a little disappointed and let down that they teased the X-Wing in the water and never saw anyone do anything with it. We jump back to Snoke, who's sitting on his throne. Leia stands in front of him. We'd have them do some discussions and make a few revelations about why Snoke is doing what he's doing. He can tell them that he has seen what the Jedi are capable of, and he has seen what the Sith are capable of. That only by wiping away both the Sith and the Jedi can the galaxy truly move on, and that only he is capable of ruling it properly. We can also establish in this speech his backstory, or we can save some of that for Episode 9. She asks Snoke what he wants with them, and he tells her that he's using them for bait for Luke and Rey. She tells them that they won't come, but Snoke seems to sense something and closes his eyes before smiling. "Are you so sure?" he asks her. Then an announcement is made that a rebel fleet has jumped in out of hyperspace. We jump to Admiral Holdo as she begins directing the bombardment of the ship, but reminds them only to incapacitate it. They begin bombing the ship, but barely seem to be making a dent. It begins firing back, destroying a ship here and there. Finally, the shields on the dreadnought go down. Holdo hails Rey, who suddenly flies in front of Holdo's ship in the Millennium Falcon. She tells Rey that she has her opening, then tells her, "May the Force be with you." Rey and a small team fly into the ship and board, but as soon as they land, the shields seem to go back up. From here out, we can occasionally jump back and forth to show Holdo leading the attack on the dreadnought, but it appearing that they aren't doing much damage. We cut to Rey, who leaves the Millennium Falcon with Chewbacca by her side. She ignites her saber staff, and we finally get to see her put all that training to good use. After a few minutes of impressive fighting, Kylo and 2 more Knights of Ren appear in the hangar. They can be the same ones from before, or 2 new Knights of Ren. Chewbacca sees Kylo and goes into a blind rage, remembering how Kylo killed his best friend. He fires his bowcaster as fast as he can, and manages to kill one of the Knights of Ren before Kylo force pulls the weapon from his hand. Chewbacca charges at Kylo, who uses a force push to keep him away, but Chewie is only temporarily stopped. Kylo lets out a bolt of force lightning, and Chewie drops to the ground. Rey charges in to fight Kylo, and they engage in a fierce lightsaber duel. It goes on for a few minutes. It begins to look like Rey might get the upper hand, but the second Knight steps in to help Kylo. They begin to corner her, and things look bad for Rey when Chewie surprises them all. He grabs the Knight and lifts him in the air, choking him. The Knight struggles and pulls out a blaster, firing several shots into him, but he won't stop. The Knight goes limp, and Chewie roars in anger at the dead man in his hands. Then a red lightsaber blade pierces his stomach from behind. It pulls out, and Chewie howls in rage and turns on Kylo. Kylo lets out another blast of force lightning, and Chewie drops to the ground once more. Kylo goes to finish him, but is blasted away by a huge force blast. Rey walks up and checks on Chewie, her eyes running with tears. Chewie passes out and she cries. Kylo recovers and captures her in her weakened state. He escorts her to Snoke. Along the way, she bounces between anger, pity, remorse, and forgiveness for Kylo, She hears Luke's voice back of her head telling her about the importance of being calm. They can have some of the same arguments that they had in episode 8 about Kylo's decisions, especially those about killing Han. Finally, they arrive at Snoke's room. Rey sees Finn, Poe, and Leia all bound and sitting on the floor in front of Snoke, and a feeling of dread washes over her. Kylo presents her to Snoke, then goes and stands next to him. Flanked behind him are Snoke's red guards, the same ones from episode 8. I would have them have a similar interaction as they did in episode 8, with Rey trying to get the upper hand and Snoke continually shutting her down each time, toying with her. It can give a glimpse of how much more powerful he is than her. He commands her to tell him where Luke is. She refuses and he begins to torture her. We cut back to Holdo, who is getting an update on the attack of Snoke's dreadnought. She's being told that the shields seem to be holding and they are losing ships, but the report is quickly cut off, and then the person says that the shields seem to have temporarily lowered, and that a Soul ship has landed on the dreadnought before the shields went back up. She asks who it was, but they don't have an answer. Then we see Snoke suddenly stop torturing Rey, as if he senses a presence on board. We cut back to the hangar, and the mystery ship lands and is revealed to be Luke's X-Wing. He gets out and is immediately attacked. And here's where I would show Luke in all his power. He is strong and none of the ship's crew are able to stop him. I would make the scene similar to Vader's rampage on the ship in Rogue One, but whereas Vader was fast and brutal, Luke is slow and calm. He fights with ease but seems to be at total peace. I really show off the true strength of Luke and show the audience how truly powerful he is. With the way he's depicted in episode 8, we basically have no real true demonstration of his power other than his force projecting at the very end. We need to see him in all his glory. He finally makes his way to Snoke's room, and he sees the captives as well as Rey lying on the ground in pain, the looks of torture obvious on her. All of Snoke's guards rush Luke instantly, but a simple flick of his hands and they all go flying across the room. Snoke laughs at the show of force. Luke walks up to Snoke and they stare at each other for a moment. Snoke tells Luke that he was surprised Luke finally came out of hiding, but Luke shows no interest in playing games. He tells him to let them all go free, or he would be forced to fight him. Snoke tells him he brought him here just for that. Snoke stands up and ignites his lightsaber. Luke drops his robe to the floor and ignites his green lightsaber. They stare in silence for a moment before diving at each other. This duel needs to be like no other duel in any medium anywhere. This needs to make every other duel look like child's play. I would show them moving so fast that from Ren and Poe's perspective they look like a blur. Drop in some slow motion to really show off their moves. Occasionally they throw some force abilities at each other. They come off as extremely powerful and closely matched. Occasionally, Snoke turns and fires off a blast of force lightning in the direction of the captives, and Luke is forced to divert his actions to protect them. Suddenly, Snoke stops. He smiles at Luke. I've been waiting so long for this, Skywalker, but it's time to end this. The Jedi and the Resistance die today. He reaches down and activates a comlink on his chair. General Hux, it is time. You hear Hux reply, yes, my lord. Luke turns to look out the window and the camera cuts back to the space battle outside. Suddenly, a large number of First Order ships jump in from hyperspace. They surround the Resistance fleet instantly and begin to attack. The Dreadnought finally lets its big cannons loose and Resistance ships begin exploding all over. Holdo begins a desperate attempt to counter the attack. An officer screams that they need to evacuate the area, but Holdo refuses. We have to give Rey and Leia more time. Luke turns back to Snoke, who has a smug grin on his face. I thank you for bringing the Resistance to me so I don't have to hunt them all over the galaxy, he tells him. Hux will destroy the fleet. I will kill you, and then I will kill them. Luke finally turns to Kylo. It isn't too late, he tells him. You can still redeem yourself, Ben. Snoke laughs. There is no Ben. There is only Kylo, and he is mine. He has been mine from the day you started training him. Kylo turns and looks at Snoke. Snoke looks to Kylo. Help me kill them and fully embrace the power of the dark side. Only then can you unlock your true potential. Kylo turns towards Snoke and ignites his lightsaber. Snoke eyes him suspiciously, and for a moment it looks like Kylo might attack Snoke. Then he nods. Yes, my master. Then he turns back towards Luke. Luke sighs heavily. I'm sorry, Ben. I failed you. Snoke laughs, and soon you will fail the galaxy. Snoke and Kylo begin to slowly walk toward Luke. Just as they are about to engage, Luke pulls out his second lightsaber, his original blue one. He is dual-wielding both of his lightsabers. Snoke is surprised by this, and Kylo seems to almost immediately recognize the blue lightsaber, the one that originally belonged to Anakin Skywalker, his grandfather. That lightsaber belongs to me, Kylo would shout. Luke shakes his head. This lightsaber belongs to the Skywalkers. Only a Skywalker can wield it effectively. I hope someday you will deserve it. Kylo shouts in a rage and dives at Luke, followed by Snoke. For a few minutes of the duel, Luke seems to be hanging in there, but he knows he can't outlast long against the combined strength of Kylo and Snoke. Finally, Rey recovers from her beatings and stands up. She pulls her lightsaber from Snoke's throne and ignites it. Snoke's guards recover and rush her. She fights them for a few minutes as Luke duels Snoke and Kylo. Luke occasionally assists Rey, and Rey occasionally assists Luke. You see them actually working together, whereas Snoke and Kylo seem to be stumbling over each other at times. Rey finally dispatches the last guard and turns to help Luke. She stands next to him, but as she takes a step forward, he tells her to stop. She looks at him confused. He continues staring at Kylo and Snoke. Get Leia and others out of here. Save the Resistance while there's still time. Rey refuses and says, "What about you? I can't abandon you." Luke shakes his head. "I need to fix a mistake I made. Go." Rey tears up a bit but nods and runs over to Leia, Finn, and Poe. Snoke yells at Kylo to stop them, but as Kylo tries to, Luke intercepts them. They make their way to the door, but Leia and Rey stop and turn back. As if sensing them, Luke says he is sorry over his shoulder to Leia. Leia lowers her head, then they both turn and run off. Finn and Poe realize they need to disable the shields to get off the ship, and make their way through the ship, shutting off the shields. Once the shields are down, they all meet in the hangar. To their surprise, the Millennium Falcon is powered up and waiting, and Chewbacca, seriously wounded but conscious, is sitting behind the controls. I was tempted to have Chewbacca die here, but I don't think we want to kill all of the original holdovers from the series. Plus, everyone loves Chewbacca. They board the Falcon and fly off towards the remnants of the Resistance fleet. Leia tells them to take her to Holdo's ship, and they land on it. She tells them to wait in the Falcon, that she needs to take control of the situation and they should be ready to leave as soon as she orders them. Then she exits the Falcon and makes her way to the bridge to talk to Holdo. We cut back to Luke, who is still dueling with Kylo and Snoke. Snoke's temper is growing, and he's finally had enough. He turns off his lightsaber and holds out both hands, aiming a massive current of Force lightning at Luke. Luke lifts his lightsabers and they absorb the lightning, but it is taking all of his effort to defend himself. Snoke turns to Kylo and yells at him to finish Luke. Kylo walks slowly towards Luke, who is straining to continue defending himself against the lightning. Luke sees Kylo walking toward him. "I'm sorry, Ben. I failed you. I should have seen the darkness in you sooner. I should have helped you sooner." Kylo takes another step towards him. Luke tells him that he forgives him, and Han forgives him for what he has done and what he is about to do. Kylo takes the last step towards him. Luke looks at him and smiles. "May the Force be with you, Ben." Snoke shouts out at Kylo to kill him. Luke closes his eyes just as Kylo brings his lightsaber down. His face shows a moment of utter peace and serenity, and just before Kylo's blade lands, Luke disappears. His lightsaber is extinguished and dropped to the ground. Luke becomes one with the Force. Kylo looks on stunned. Snoke sneers and looks out the window. "Only one left and we can be done with all this." Kylo bends down and picks up the blue lightsaber and stares at it for a moment before putting it beneath his robes. We jump back to Leia, who is talking with Holdo when she stops suddenly and turns to look back at the dreadnought. "Luke," is all she says. Then it cuts to Rey, who is sitting in the cockpit when she stops suddenly as well. Her eyes fill with tears once more as she senses Luke become one with the Force. We cut back to Leia, who finally turns back to Holdo. She puts her hand on Holdo's shoulder. She tells Holdo to evacuate everyone and save the Resistance. Holdo acknowledges and then orders the evacuation. Then Leia stops her. "This means you as well. Go down to the Millennium Falcon and get out of here. You're in charge now." Holdo refuses and Leia tells her that her time is done, and that her last order is that Holdo save the Resistance and end the First Order. Holdo starts to object, but Leia gives her that classic look, and she decides not to. She hugs her and leaves the bridge to Leia. We cut back to the Falcon as Holdo boards. She commands them to leave and they refuse, asking where Leia is. Holdo tells them what happened and they refuse to leave. Rey gets on the comm and calls Leia, telling her that she can't lose her and Luke. Leia tells her that she has to leave and that everything will be fine. After some more arguing, Leia orders Poe to fly off. Poe acknowledges sadly, and the Falcon lifts off. Rey yells at Poe to land the ship, but he doesn't, and they fly off. Now I'm going to take another scene from The Last Jedi, but I'm going to alter it a bit. I would have Leia take the ship she has, and she will use it like Holdo did in Episode 8, setting it to light speed and crashing it through several ships, clearing a path for the remaining Resistance ships to jump out and get away. Leia and Luke are two of the biggest and most important characters in Star Wars, and they both need a demonstration of how awesome they are, and they both need to go out like badasses. Also, this will be a fitting tribute to Carrie Fisher, since it was her last film. She should have an amazing exit. It doesn't make sense to me to introduce Holdo and try and prop her up as this great leader, just to turn around and kill her off in the same movie. She got shortchanged. And since Carrie Fisher can't be Leia in Episode 9 without CGI, it makes sense to give leadership over to Holdo for the future of the series. We've developed a new character who will hopefully carry over into the next films. After they get away, Holdo gives a speech that is sent out across the galaxy. She explains that the famous Luke and Leia sacrificed themselves for the good of the galaxy, fighting the tyranny of the First Order. She will say that the resistance is bloodied but not broken, and that as long as there are still one of them left alive to fight, there will always be hope for the galaxy. Then she would implore everyone in the galaxy to throw off the shackles of oppression and help them to return the galaxy back to order. We cut to Finn, who is trying to console Rey. They would have a few minutes to talk before Rey asks to be alone. Finn gets up and leaves, and Rey would sit in the room alone. She'd try and close her eyes to meditate, but images of Luke flash in her head. Her eyes would slowly open in frustration. Then, a hand would rest on her shoulder in a familiar blue hue. She would turn up to its source and her eyes would go wide in surprise, and the camera would cut away to that Star Wars logo.